Every Saturday at 5:00 p.m. sharp. The house on Maple Lane came alive with the clatter of dishes and the smell of roast chicken and apple pie. For Margaret Maggie Lawson, it was the only time the house didn't feel so quiet. It had been almost 3 years since her husband, Peter, passed away. After the funeral, when the casseroles stopped coming and the phone stopped ringing, Maggie had clung to one thing: family dinner. It was her lifeline. Her 2 adult children, Ethan and Rachel, would come with their kids. And for a few hours, she'd pretend everything was still whole. That particular Saturday, the leaves were falling like golden confetti outside the window as Maggie stirred the butternut squash soup. She glanced at the clock. 4:59. Right on cue. Ethan's car pulled up in the driveway. Of course. Her son had always been precise, never late. Never early. Maggie couldn't help but smile. Some things don't change, she whispered, tossing in a pinch of thyme. The front door creaked open without a knock. Mom Ethan's voice echoed from the hallway, curt, businesslike, like he was walking into a board meeting. In the kitchen, she called out. He walked in, placed a bottle of budget red wine on the counter, a brand she disliked but never mentioned, and glanced around with that familiar look of silent judgment. Smells good, he muttered. Roast potatoes and your favorite apple pie, Maggie said, finally turning to him. Ethan, at 46, looked worn. His once sandy blonde hair had grayed at the temples, and a deep furrow sat permanently between his brows. Rachel and the kids coming? He asked, pouring himself a glass of water. She said she'd try, Maggie replied, though she already sensed the excuse forming. Rachel had been unpredictable lately. Ethan rolled his eyes. Figures. Always some drama. Maggie bit her tongue. The 2 siblings never got along. Jealousy, competition. Who knew? But warmth between them had been rare since they were kids. The doorbell rang. Rachel. Maggie wiped her hands and walked to the front door. There stood her daughter, perfume too strong, eyeliner slightly smudged, exhaustion in every line of her face. Behind her were Olivia, glued to her phone, and Jake, darting past Maggie with barely a glance. Hi. Mom? Rachel offered a quick hug. Sorry we're late. Olivia couldn't decide what to wear. I didn't want to come, Olivia mumbled without looking up. Maggie smiled tightly. Come in. Dinner's just ready. As they entered, Rachel turned sharply. Please tell me you didn't cook anything with gluten. I started a gluten-free cleanse this week. Of course she did. Maggie didn't say the gravy had flour and the pie crust was store-bought. She just nodded. I'll get the bread and butter. Inside the dining room. Ethan had already set the silverware. He greeted Rachel with a sarcastic, How's the pharmacy empire, Rachel? A chain store pharmacist. Straightened. It's not an empire. It's essential health work. Sure. Sleeping pills and multivitamins. Changing lives. Ethan muttered. Maggie placed the roast on the table, trying to break the tension. Kids. Let's not do this. Jake was already playing on his handheld. Olivia was still scrolling. No one looked up. This wasn't a family dinner anymore. It was a performance one Maggie had produced, directed, and catered, but no one was watching. She sat down at the head of the table, folding her hands as the noise of forks and phones filled the silence. And for the first time in a long time, she asked herself, why am I still doing this? Dinner had barely started, and the air already felt too thick to breathe. Jake tapped away on his game console. Olivia picked at her salad without lifting her eyes from her phone. Ethan shoveled roast potatoes into his mouth while checking his watch between bites. Rachel looked visibly irritated with everything from the food to the lighting to the fact she had to be there at all. Maggie tried to ignore it. She asked about school. About work? About the kids' upcoming plans. No one really answered. It was like tossing questions into a well and waiting for echoes that never came back. Then, as Maggie was pouring coffee and slicing into the still warm apple pie, Rachel cleared her throat. Mom, can we talk? Just us. Ethan rolled his eyes. Here we go. Maggie stood, a bit surprised. Of course. Let's step into the kitchen. Rachel followed her, arms crossed tight across her chest. Her expression had shifted from irritation to something that looked suspiciously like desperation. Once the door swung shut behind them, Rachel didn't waste a second. I need $6,000. The pie knife paused mid-slice. I'm sorry, 6,000. Rachel repeated, almost defensively. Jake's medical bills. Olivia needs a new laptop for school. My car's acting up. Can you help me out this once? This once, Maggie asked softly. Placing the knife down, Rachel's jaw tensed. Mom. Please. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. Maggie exhaled slowly. For years. She'd been the safety net, the one who just helped out this once. Every time. College tuition. Rent. Babysitters. Medical expenses. Car trouble, there was always something. Always someone who needed her more than she needed herself. I can't. Maggie said at last. The words tasted foreign, like betrayal. Rachel blinked. Stunned. What I said, I can't. Rachel. Not this time. For a moment, Rachel didn't say anything. Then the shift came, rage, pushing aside shock. Wow. You know what, I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been more willing to help Ethan anyway. That's not true. Yes. It is. She snapped. You paid for his down payment. You helped send Ben to some fancy school across the country. Meanwhile, I'm drowning and you're standing on the shore watching me sink. Maggie felt her chest tighten. I have helped you. Over and over. Rachel laughed bitter. Sharp. You think throwing some money my way makes you a good mother. You have no idea what it's like to be doing this alone. To feel like you're always behind. Always one emergency away from losing everything. I've done everything I could for you. Maggie said, her voice beginning to shake. Except, love me the way you love Ethan. That one landed like a knife. You ruined my life. Mom, Rachel whispered. You protected him. You babied him. You made me strong so you could neglect me and not feel bad about it. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them. Maggie's hands trembled on the edge of the counter. She wanted to scream. To defend herself. To say that none of this was fair. But nothing came out. I don't want your pee. Rachel spat. And I don't want your guilt either. She turned and stormed out of the kitchen, gathering the kids as she went. The front door slammed a few seconds later. Maggie didn't follow. She stood in the silence. The pie still steaming on the counter. Untouched. She had given everything her time. Her savings. Her energy. Her heart. And in return, blame. Bitterness. And now, a slammed door. Maggie sat down slowly at the kitchen table, face in her hands, and whispered to herself, maybe I've done enough. Maggie barely slept that night. She tossed, turned, and stared at the ceiling fan as it spun shadows across her bedroom walls. Rachel's words wouldn't stop echoing. You ruined my life. You've always loved Ethan more. At 3:12 a.m. Maggie sat up in bed. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the lamp. The room lit up in soft amber light. She grabbed the old spiral notebook from her nightstand, the one she used to write grocery lists and birthday reminders. But this list would be different. At the top of the page, she wrote, "What to do for me. Call Hannah Briggs' attorney. Update will. Withdraw cash. $15. Ling. Call Liz. Ask about Pine Hollow Cabin. Prepare house. Unplug. Clean. Disappear. Leave note." She paused. Ben hovering. It wasn't revenge she was after. It was air. Space. A life that hadn't been shaped around the needs of everyone else? When the sun rose over Riverbend, Maggie was already dressed. Hair brushed. Tea steeping. She looked calm. But inside, something had shifted. By 9:00 a.m., she was parked outside Briggs & Holmes, a law office tucked into an old craftsman building near the town square. Hannah Briggs, a woman in her early 40s with sharp glasses and a kind smile, greeted her like an old friend. "Miss Lawson, come on in. What brings you by? I need to make some changes to my will," Maggie said, her voice steady. Hannah nodded and pulled out a legal pad. "I'd like to sell my house when I pass. The proceeds should be split between my 3 grandchildren, Ben, Olivia, and Jake, but they can't access it until they're 25. And your children," Maggie hesitated. $10,000 each. Nothing more." Hannah blinked, but said nothing. She kept writing. "And I'd like to appoint Liz Harper as executor." "No longer, Ethan. No," Maggie said firmly. "Liz knows me. She won't be manipulated." After signing a few papers and locking in the changes, Maggie walked straight to the bank. The young teller looked surprised when Maggie requested $15. Oh, zero in cash. Home repairs, Maggie offered with a small smile. Later that afternoon, she sat on her back porch, tea in hand, watching the golden leaves fall across the yard she'd tended for decades. The place suddenly felt like a museum full of memories she no longer wanted to maintain. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan, Mom. "I need the deed to the house for tax filing. Can you find it? No, how are you? No, I'm sorry about last night. Just a request." Maggie put the phone face down. She picked it back up and called Liz Harper. "Liz. It's Maggie. I need to ask a favor." "Anything." "I'm thinking of staying at the Pine Hollow Cabin for a while." "Is it still being rented out?" There was a pause. "Yes. But only to a young couple. They just renewed, but they were already planning to leave in a few months." "What's going on?" "Maggie, I just need some space." Liz didn't press. She never did. "I'll call them. Offer to cover their moving costs. Triple the month's rent if needed." "You sure?" "I'm sure." As Maggie hung up, she felt her heartbeat slow for the first time in days. That little wooden cabin, tucked in the hills outside town, had been her secret for 15 years. Purchased with money left to her by her late Aunt Edna, it had always been a kind of backup plan. A life raft she never thought she'd need. Until now. That evening, Maggie left a single note on her dining table. It read, "I took your words to heart. I won't be in the way anymore. Maggie." And for the first time in her life, she was doing something not for her kids. Not for Peter. Not for show. But for herself. The road to Pine Hollow curved through dense Oregon pines and golden fields touched by October's chill. Maggie hadn't driven this stretch in years. But the way it twisted along the hills still felt familiar like muscle memory. She pulled up to the small cedar cabin just after sunrise. The roof was mossy. The porch, a little crooked. But to Maggie, it looked like freedom. She parked her car, grabbed her overnight bag, and stepped out into crisp morning air that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. A single envelope sat taped to the door. "Welcome back, Liz." Inside, the place was exactly as she remembered. Wooden walls, faded floral curtains, an old rocking chair beside a stone fireplace. The last tenants had left it clean but impersonal. Maggie ran her hand along the kitchen counter. It felt like a blank canvas. She didn't unpack everything that day. Just the essentials: a few changes of clothes, a tea kettle, her books, and a framed photo of her as a young mother holding baby Ethan Rachel, clinging to her side. By noon, Liz arrived with a box of supplies and her familiar smile. "You made it," she said, wrapping Maggie in a hug. "I half expected you to change your mind." "I almost did," Maggie admitted, "but then I remembered how good it feels to breathe." They spent the afternoon organizing the pantry, flipping mattresses, and setting up Maggie's reading nook by the window. As they hung a wind chime on the front porch, Maggie turned to her friend. "I feel like I ran away." "No," Liz said, handing her a warm mug of cider. "You didn't run. You reclaimed." That night, Maggie sat alone on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the sun set behind the ridge for the first time in decades. She wasn't waiting for someone to call. She wasn't checking the time for dinner, for medicine, for anyone else's needs. Her phone remained off. Over the next few days, Maggie found a rhythm. Morning started with strong coffee and a quiet walk around the overgrown garden. She clipped weeds, raked leaves, unearthed old flower beds that had long been forgotten. Each hour spent in dirt felt like therapy: slow, patient, healing. On Thursday, Liz picked her up for the weekly gardening club in town. The community center was modest, a white building with peeling paint, but the inside buzzed with warmth and voices. Most members were older, like Maggie, their hands weathered, their eyes kind. No one asked her about her family. No one expected her to show up with cookies or carpool sign-up sheets. They just welcomed her. "I'm Marlene," said a woman in a floppy sun hat. "This is my 3rd year here. I used to teach middle school. I ran a daycare." Maggie replied with a shy smile. "But I haven't gardened in years." "Then you're due." Marlene winked. They spent the morning sharing tips, pruning rose cuttings, and swapping seeds. Maggie laughed, truly laughed, when one of the women knocked over a bag of compost and blamed the squirrels. She hadn't laughed like that in ages. Afterward, Liz and Maggie went to a cafe nearby for lunch. Over sandwiches and sweet tea. Liz leaned in. "Have you thought about calling them yet?" Maggie shook her head. "They haven't earned that call." Later that night, back at the cabin, she opened her email, not her phone, and saw subject lines waiting like ghosts. "Mom, where are you? Please, just reply. Ben needs your help. Jake is sick. I'm sorry." She didn't open any of them. Not yet. She turned off the laptop, wrapped herself in the blanket again, and whispered, "They're learning what it's like to need someone who doesn't answer." By the second week of Maggie's quiet retreat, the cracks back home had started to widen. It began with Ethan. He'd always been the responsible one. The one with spreadsheets and color-coded calendars. The one Maggie had relied on to fix the gutters or handle tax season. But now, his structure was buckling. A quarterly report he was responsible for at work had gone sideways. He couldn't find the deed to the house, nor the insurance files Maggie had always stored. His email to her, short and clipped, had gone unanswered. His follow-up text, "Mom, this is serious. I need those papers." Still. Silence. Without her quietly holding the administrative threads together, his world felt looser, unstable. At home, takeout boxes piled up. Laundry remained unfolded. His son, Ben, called less. And when he did, it wasn't to ask for help with school. It was to ask if Grandma was okay. Meanwhile, Rachel was unraveling faster. Jake had developed a fever that wouldn't break. Rachel had to take unpaid leave from the pharmacy to stay home with him. Olivia, already emotionally distant, had become openly hostile. One night, after a screaming match, the teen slammed her bedroom door and didn't come out for hours. Rachel called every number she had for her mother, left voicemails, texts, even messages through Ben. Nothing. By the end of that week, Olivia dropped a bombshell. She was dropping out of school for the semester. Said she was tired of pretending things were fine. Rachel didn't cry at first. But later, in the car outside the urgent care center, she broke down, forehead pressed against the steering wheel. The image of her mother's face, so calm, so steady, haunted her. Back in Pine Hollow, Maggie stood in the middle of the small garden she had begun restoring. Her hands were buried in cool soil, planting winter bulbs. She didn't know the full extent of what was happening back in Riverbend, but she felt it like a ripple under the surface. Still, she didn't reach for her phone. That day, Liz dropped by with groceries and news. "Ben called me," she said gently, placing a bag of apples on the kitchen counter. "He's working nights now, bartending near campus." Maggie looked up. "What?" he said. "Ethan can't help him with tuition anymore. He's trying to keep his grades up, but he's exhausted." Maggie's chest tightened. "And Rachel?" she asked. Liz hesitated. "Jake's been sick. Olivia left school. She's trying, but she's overwhelmed." Maggie gripped the edge of the counter. The weight of those words wasn't guilt, it was clarity. The family had leaned on her for so long. They'd forgotten how to balance without her. Or maybe she'd never given them the chance to learn. She stepped outside and stared at the mountains lining the horizon. The sun was setting again, casting long orange streaks across the trees. She thought of Ben working into the night, of Rachel sitting alone by Jake's bed, of Ethan standing in an office under fluorescent lights, trying to hold it all together. This wasn't about punishment. This wasn't about teaching them a lesson. It had become something else entirely. Later that evening, Maggie turned on her phone for the first time in weeks. The screen lit up 27 missed calls. 14 voicemails. Dozens of texts. The last message. From Ben. "Read Grandma. I'm not asking for help. I just need to know you're okay." And for the first time since she'd left, Maggie felt something crack open. Not weakness. Not regret. But the quiet beginnings of grace. It was a Saturday afternoon when Maggie heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. She was in the garden, pruning back the lavender bushes, when she looked up and saw a dark blue Chevy pulling into the narrow driveway. Her breath caught in her throat. Ethan stepped out first. Then Rachel. Both looked older than they had a month ago, shoulders stooped, eyes hollow, like they hadn't slept in days. Maggie's hands froze on the garden shears. "How did they find me?" Rachel spotted her first. Mom Maggie stood slowly, brushing dirt off her gloves. She said nothing as they made their way up the path. Ethan looked nervous. Rachel looked angry. "You've been here this whole time," Rachel demanded, motioning toward the cabin. "Do you have any idea what we've been through? I made tea." Maggie said calmly, "Come sit on the porch." They followed her warily. like strangers. Approaching a wild animal uncertain whether it would bite or cry. The porch was warm with late afternoon sun. Maggie poured chamomile tea into 3 chipped mugs and sat across from them in the old wicker chair. There was silence. Ethan broke it first. Mom, why didn't you tell us where you were? Maggie took a sip of tea. Because I knew you wouldn't understand until you had to. Rachel scoffed. Understand what it feels like to give everything and be treated like furniture. Maggie said quietly. To be useful. But invisible. Ethan looked down. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but no words came. I've been your safety net for years. Maggie continued. Every missed payment. Every emergency. Every broken appliance. I was there. But not once did either of you stop to ask how I was doing. I asked. Rachel muttered. No. Maggie said gently but firmly. You demanded. There's a difference. Ethan finally looked up. You could have just told us. Instead of disappearing. I tried. Over the years. I hinted. I cracked. I cried. You were too busy needing me to notice I was drowning. The silence stretched. Rachel blinked rapidly. Her voice shaking. Jake got sick. Olivia left school. I didn't know how to handle it all without you. And that, Maggie said, is exactly the point. Ethan's voice was quieter. Ben's working nights. I almost lost my job. Everything's been falling apart. Maggie's eyes softened. Because you built your lives assuming I'd always be the foundation. Rachel's voice cracked. You're our mom. Aren't moms supposed to be there? I'm still your mom. Maggie said. Sitting here, mug down. But I'm also a person. One with limits. Feelings. And a right to peace. And from now on, the terms of our relationship are going to change. Ethan leaned forward. What do you mean? I mean, no more unannounced visits. No more last-minute emergencies that become my burden. You can ask for help. But I reserve the right to say no. Without guilt. And I won't be anyone's ATM or free babysitter anymore. Rachel stared at her like she was speaking another language. Ethan nodded slowly. That's fair. Maggie looked at both of them. I didn't disappear to punish you. I left to survive. And I'm not asking you to fix everything. I just want to be seen. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can be who you need me to be. You don't have to be perfect. Maggie whispered. You just have to try. As the wind rustled the pines, the 3 of them sat in silence. Not angry. Not broken. Just finally, honest. They stayed for another hour. Ethan and Rachel didn't cry. Not really. But they did something Maggie hadn't seen in years. They listened. No interruptions. No justifications. Just the quiet hum of understanding starting to take root. Before they left, Ethan hugged her for longer than usual and whispered, We'll do better. Rachel paused at the steps, looked back, and said, I'm scared, but I'll try. Maggie smiled. A little tired. A little unsure. But for the first time in a long while, it wasn't a forced smile. It came from someplace real. When the car drove off down the gravel path, dust trailing behind them like a soft goodbye, Maggie stood on the porch until it disappeared behind the trees. She exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not sadness. Something in between. That night, Maggie walked through her cabin, and took in the space she'd created. The curtains she'd picked, the books she'd organized, the garden she'd started from scratch. Her hands brushed over the framed photo of her with the kids when they were little, back when they thought she had all the answers. Back when she tried to. The next morning, She woke early and made herself pancakes. Just for her, she put on the music she liked. Not the classical Ethan preferred. Not the noise Rachel complained about. Something soft and folky that drifted across the kitchen as she cooked. Later, she met Liz and a few others from the gardening club to plant tulip bulbs for spring. Maggie wore her wide-brimmed hat and dirt-stained gloves like badges of honor. Thomas gentle. Warm-eyed Thomas walked with her afterward around the edge of the community trail. "I saw your kids leaving yesterday," he said. "How did it go?" "They're finally starting to see me," Maggie said. "Not just as a mother. As a person." Thomas smiled. It's never too late for people to grow up. They walked in silence for a while before he asked, "Still thinking about that road trip to Montana?" She grinned. "To the mountains?" he corrected. "And yes, I am too," Maggie said. "I just might need a co-pilot." He chuckled. "I've got the playlists ready, back at the cabin." Maggie sat in her favorite chair by the window with a cup of tea and her old journal in her lap. She flipped past grocery lists and birthday reminders until she reached the first page, the one she'd written that sleepless night before she left. "What to do for me?" She smiled. The boxes were nearly all checked now. That evening, she opened her email. A new message from Ben sat at the top. "Just 2 lines, Grandma. Thank you. I know this wasn't easy. You've taught me more by leaving than all the times you stayed. I love you." Her eyes filled, but not with sorrow. It was peace. Maggie closed the laptop and walked outside. The garden smelled like fresh earth and possibility. The wind danced through the trees with a freedom she finally understood. She wasn't going back to who she was. Because now she knew she didn't have to be everything for everyone to be worthy of love. She didn't need to be needed to matter. She was more than a mother. More than a caregiver. She was Maggie Lawson. A woman who had finally chosen herself. And that was the real beginning.